Well, let's have you start by introducing yourself.
I am a clinical treatment supervisor, so I'll do consultations with future prospective patients to see if they're good fits for treatment here, if they'll respond well, and what we can do to help them get their lives back. We also do reported findings, so all that data from the functional MRI, we will sit down with the patient and explain all of that data, which can be quite hefty. Right now we're looking at 27 different functional systems, and each functional system has different regions, and those regions communicate with each other. The patient needs someone to lead them and explain it, and that's what we do, and then we send them off to treatment. And then throughout the week, I'm just making sure that they're getting what they need. I'm meeting with their therapists. We're talking about how to move with them during therapy, because therapy here is an iterative process. At the end of the week, I describe the data from the second scan.
Awesome. And I also hear that you've been working on the imaging side and continuing to develop the capabilities here.
Yes, to a degree. Less with the functional MRI and more with a system called Fmri, or functional near-infrared spectroscopy. This is incorrect, but the best way to describe it in one sentence would almost be a wearable fMRI. That's the reason that's not correct, is that we're not getting an image of the brain, but we are looking at blood flow in the brain using infrared lights. Infrared can penetrate skin and even bone pretty easily and is absorbed by blood. Here's a cap right here.
Oh, this looks awesome.
Do you want to go ahead and hold it? So we have a bunch of sources, so emitters of light and then detectors.
Oh, and they're not at the same place. So this is like an infrared LED.
Yep.
And then an infrared detector.
Yes.
So they're filtering out visible light and only picking up infrared.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you can wear them in the light and not just the dark.
Exactly. You want to still control for those things a little bit. What's great about this thing is that, you've got really, really good temporal resolution. So we can see changes very quickly, and you can stand up with it. You can sit with it. Other things is, when you're in a scanner, there's loud noises around you, so it's hard to get into the auditory system. This we can put on someone, have them do a task, have them sit up.
And then it's all on board, like all the recording is on board?
For this system, yes.
That's very cool.
It connects with Bluetooth, and you can even, theoretically, this particular system, you could take to a grocery store, and we could have a little button that says, here are the events we want to measure, and then take it back to the computer and look at the data.
That's wild. Please. Can I try it on?
Absolutely. So as you can see, the advantage here is we could
with the snug fit
take quicker measurements from a patient throughout the week.
Right.
We could
and continual measurements, right? You don't just have to do it one shot.
Theoretically, you could do continual measurements. Putting that cap on a patient for
it's
the
pretty
whole
tight.
day.
It's pretty tight.
We have different cap sizes.
Might give me a headache. Yeah.
So at this point, we could put it on at different points of the day, some measurements, have them do activities.
That's very cool.
Other research being done with this is they'll have, in labs, they'll have people having conversations. Both of them are wearing the caps. So you can see, okay, this person's listening, this person's talking, and have those two data points synced together.
Yeah. And so how does this compare with the fMRI?
So most people are familiar with the structural MRI.
Yeah.
Which, you put you in this giant, in our case, it's a 1.5 Tesla magnet. And, by giving these magnetic pulses and aligning fields and seeing how those fields decay over time, we can look at different tissues because of their different composition of fats and fluid.
And they provide different magnetic interference, is that right?
There's different tissues that are going to decay differently in that magnetic field or with that magnetic pulse.
Got it.
Look,
so you send a pulse and then you look for magnetic response.
Many of those magnetic fields will align.
Yep.
And then you do a perpendicular pulse essentially, and then look to see, okay, these tissues are coming back at this rate, that's going to be your white matter. This is your gray matter, this is bone, etc. What fMRI does is now looks at, you can take a structural image, but then you can overlay blood flow. Because as oxygenated blood comes in and pushes out deoxygenated blood, obviously that concentration of blood is going to decay differently. And we can see, here's all this, we have a lot of blood coming into that area.
So it's not just presence of blood, but it's presence of oxygenated blood, which is new blood that's come up from the lungs.
So we can look at that bolt signal.
And you're getting a much more real-time signal from that. You're taking images more quickly.
Yes.
At the cost of resolution, is that?
Again, more Dr. Allen questions.
Yeah. It's too bad Dr. Allen's not here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yes, you're taking a bunch of pictures, but again, this is where we can contrast the MRI with the FNIRS. Is spatial resolution is really, really great with the fMRI. We can see these different voxels and look at this point on these single voxel levels at different parts of the brain.
Spatial resolution is like resolution of an image that you would normally think of, right? Is how big are the pixels, right? How big are and we talk voxels because it's 3 dimensions, not 2 dimensions.
And I think a good analogy would be TVs nowadays, right? Are we looking at 4K resolution and in megapixels? How crisp is the image? That's the spatial resolution. Your temporal resolution is your frame rate.
Right.
And
how many images are you getting over?
Absolutely.
Time?
Yeah. And with the fMRI, the temporal resolution, that frame rate, in many cases, is slower than what we can do with smaller channels on the FNIRS.
That's cool.
So we do sacrifice the images, right? We're not looking at an image of the brain where the blood is. We're looking at, okay, where these are positioned, these optodes, what's the blood beneath them?
Got it.
But we can see how quickly those changes
are
happening.
And so you can see not just the blood on top of the skull, but actually beneath the skull?
Yes.
That's wild.
Yes. And, there's a whole nerdy section where we say, okay, how do we differentiate scalp blood flow versus what's intracranial blood flow?
Right.
Which you can do by having, the shorter these channels are, the distances between the two channels, the closer it's going to be reading. So the further apart you get, the deeper the reading. You also get more noise and weaker
I was
signal.
wondering why they're so spread out.
Some of the standard in the field and the research is to have these things called short separation channels. Not always necessarily needed. There's still some thought, like if you're working on children, there's really, their skulls are pretty thin as it is, so you may not need it.
Yeah.
But if you do a channel that's close together, you can see more local responses. And far apart, you'll see deeper responses.
Right.
So you could theoretically take the deep channel minus the short separation and say,
and
okay,
figure out depth.
Yeah, that's scalp information, and we
cool.
can see the deep information.
That's quite cool. And so, it really is a question of which lights and detectors are you activating together at the same time.
Yes.
And then I would imagine that starts to affect the more detectors and lights you have affects your temporal resolution.
Yes.
So
because
you're trading off spatial versus temporal. Yeah.
So you do have to move through them, and the more and more you put on there, then you're going to sacrifice that temporal resolution for this. But yeah, you're going to get more of the brain.
That's really awesome. Yeah, that's very, very cool. I had a question about the fMRI. We can see the difference between oxygenated and non-oxygenated blood, right? So we can see blood flow because of that, right? As opposed to sort of stagnant blood that's not moving very quickly. But the reports that you gave me, we haven't really showed it. I don't want to show too much details of my brain, but maybe we'll show one that is relatively
beautiful.
good. Yeah, right. We'll show the good one. This one's pretty good. So this is an example of one of the pages of the report, and this one is verbal working memory and internal monitoring, right? So those are two types of tasks.
Functional system your brain uses to get through the day, essentially.
Yeah. And there are two pieces to this, right? So there's region response, which, if I understand correctly, that's is there blood flow in the area, right? Is that part of the brain working?
Yes, and how does that compare to our control group?
Right.
Exactly.
The more interesting one for me is the interregion communication, and I'm curious, how do you learn that from an fMRI?
This does kind of go back to some older studies done, I believe, in monkeys. I don't know, there's the Bible of neuroscience, Kandel, goes into a whole chapter of looking at EEG, electroencephalography, kind of population responses of neurons and kind of the electric fields around them. It's kind of like listening to a population.
Yeah.
Right? But the temporal resolution on EEG is really, really good.
You're measuring electrical signals.
Exactly.
Yep.
But what if you look at electrical signals in different regions of the brain after some sort of stimulus, right?
Okay.
And so, what we're looking at here is communication. So if you give a stimulus, you look at two different regions, and it's like they're just random.
Yeah.
There's no correlation. There's nothing. And it's like, oh, they're not connected. You give a stimulus, and these start to have synced up. This is very layman's, right?
Yes. But I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Is if you look at two regions and they're responding in sequence with each other.
So if we look at this, there's a stimulus, right? This test.
Yep.
We're looking at these regions that kind of communicate together, and this is like this functional system works together. If you're over here on the left, the left, this is that random, spontaneous, they're not connected. This green's nice. They're correlating together. But what happens if you give a stimulus and they are just locked in? They're communicating too much.
Yeah.
That's over there to the left.
I see. Oh, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, they're like really connected.
Yeah.
You know, there's lots of ways that can be interpreted, right? So if someone comes in to us and they have regions that are not getting enough blood flow,
Yep.
and then that same functional system, you have other regions that are communicating too much, we could
Yeah.
look at that and say, okay, you know, some part of your brain's not working hard enough, so other parts have to compensate.
And it's kind of routing around.
Right. Or some others are codependent. They're like, I need to communicate with you. I can't burden this load. I don't have enough resources. I don't have the blood. I don't have the glucose, the oxygen, things that I need. Now, after a week of giving you a lot of therapies, if we see increases in communication, you know, interpretation could be a little different, right?
Yeah.
That could be,
Right.
oh, you're learning.
Right.
Your brain is making new
And
connections, and that
And that
over time
neuroplasticity it's actually changing the structure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
That's pretty
the
awesome.
biggest thing here is we want to see these regions move. We want to see, or the responses move. They might, for a little bit, move, kind of overcorrect, because the whole brain is balancing now. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm finally done working so hard because this region finally started picking up the
and
load.
so you actually have some stuff come down that's a good signal
Yes.
from treatment.
Yes, and some stuff might go up a little bit as it's now acclimating.
Right, right. So let's talk about, you know, when you have this report and you know, this we picked a good page. I don't want to talk too much about the areas in which my brain specifically isn't working properly. But I've got regions that are red. I've got some connections that are not great.
Mm-hmm.
So you get back this report, and then what do you do? Like how does that feed into treatment?
Yeah, so we'll look at that report and we'll see there's an initial broad strokes, right? We can see a few things. First thing I look at is how you did overall in that scan.
Yeah.
Did it look like by the time you got to that third test that you were just cognitively exhausted?
Oh, that's super interesting. I hadn't heard that up until now.
And it's, you know, that's something that we'll look at, like, oh, does this person just seem like they're fatiguing over time? But the other big things are looking at those functional systems on the whole. Things like target search. There's a functional system that is the frontal eye fields that deal with coordinating eye movements together and tracking, looking for things that are important.
Like doing a word search or something like
Exactly.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, or even our patients will come to us and say, this might sound weird, but I can't find anything on a menu. If I go to the store, go to the restaurant, I try to look for something, I can't find it. Or if I go to the store, I'm looking for a can of soup, I can't find it. I don't scan well. Well, the brain's communicating with the eyes poorly, so they can't track. Reading becomes hard, and like I can't read anymore. It's because your eyes can't track.
I spoke with someone who said that they couldn't find anything in the refrigerator. Mm-hmm. They would open the refrigerator and they couldn't identify what was there.
Right.
And they had to get someone else to come look for them.
Exactly. And then there's some other functional systems we'll look at, like word production.
Yeah.
And word retrieval. So our cognitive therapists will say, okay, let's work on some more word memory tasks, verbal working memory. There might be systems that deal with attention and multitasking. So we'll start having them do those memory tasks, but making it harder and forcing those patients to be more attentive, to use things like distraction suppression, which is a fancy way of saying shutting out loud things that go on around you.
And you've got some therapists that really enjoy
I bet.
creating distraction.
It's oftentimes they'll say, like, what do you like to listen to? I'm gonna look it up on YouTube, and you don't realize that it's because they're going to essentially get areas of the brain that haven't been working the way they should. They're not getting the blood they need,
Right.
and so we're activating them.
Yeah.
And when we activate them, those neurons send out signals to the cells around the blood vessels saying, hey, I need more blood, I need more glucose, oxygen.
I wondered how that worked. Because this is a lot about restoring that blood flow. Right.
And what is it? It's a coupling between neurons and vasculature, neurovascular coupling.
Got it.
And so a lot of what we do here is reestablishing that neurovascular coupling.
And so by stimulating the neurons, you're encouraging more blood flow. Mm-hmm. Because the neurons demand it. That's really awesome.
So that's a lot of what goes on here. And our therapists are incredible.
I think incredible is an understatement. I've been so impressed by the team here. Categorically, like every single person is awesome.
We can't stop talking about how cool the Fmri is, right? And all the techniques we use. But what really needs to be underlined is the fact that we have an incredible team. And where else can you be somewhere for a week where each day we're reiterating what we're going to be doing depending on how your scan was, how you performed the day before, and what you need.
I was looking back at the week of how many different appointments I've had, right? It's literally like my day is broken up into hour chunks, and I'm with a different person doing a different thing each one of those blocks all throughout the day with a 1 hour break for lunch. And I was thinking through, prior to coming here, how much time it would have taken me to have all of those different appointments. I think it probably would have taken me close to a year of like near full-time work to schedule all those appointments, to drive to them, and there would have been huge gaps in between, And so just the like basic logistics of being in one building where everybody is stellar and it's one right after another, and I don't have to do all the scheduling work. And it seems so basic, and yet it's so critical, particularly when you've got a concussion and can't be, the project manager, patient advocate for yourself.
Just think about all the times you've had to remember what your doctor said for the other doctor.
Correct. Yeah, and like I would bring I'd bring my father with me to appointments to take notes, because I couldn't have a conversation and remember all of it enough to be able to articulate it, in an hour meeting. And I couldn't sit there and take notes myself and stay engaged. So.
Well, it's really important for mild traumatic brain injury, because even though there's this classic profile of symptoms, everyone kind of has a different constellation of symptoms. And like, what do we focus more on this person's autonomic symptoms? Do we focus more on issues with eye movements and visual problems, visual processing? Or do we do more cognitive, memory, brain fog symptoms?
And I've been talking to other patients this week, and they're getting completely different therapies than I am. We've all kind of got the same schedule, but we're doing different things in each appointment. People are wearing buzzers over their ears to correct the vestibular system that like we haven't even tried on me because it's not an issue. So you have a huge repertoire of treatments and technologies. If you could pick only 3 technologies that you currently have here and get rid of the rest, what would you choose?
Well, obviously we're keeping the Fmri.
Yeah.
That's a really, really great question. First, the Fmri.
Yeah.
Then also the artificial learning system that we do with like scheduling.
Oh. Because the scheduling seems very random from a patient's perspective.
It is. There is a huge, the reason I bring this up is because we can see the Fmri. It's incredible. That's number one. Yep. But there's what goes on behind the scenes. How do we logistically handle a clinic full of all these different therapists, different patients, and when things might be changing, or even if a therapist wants to go on vacation, how do you handle that? How do you handle patients with different needs? To design this great system that will go and 4 weeks ahead, we'll start to move blocks around. Like, okay, we have these many patients. Here's what these patients may need. Here's the therapists that are available, and then puts them in the block. And we definitely, there are times where having cardio at a certain time will be important, or making sure that they do their scan. They're able to get that scan in along with their therapies on a Thursday or Friday. I pull it out because I know that we benefit from it. Yeah. But it is still a black box to me.
That's awesome. None of the things that you mentioned are like, the Dynavision board or the,
I think an important part of what happens behind the curtain, what keeps everything moving. Think about even the parts of if I pull apart like an amplifier, I'm a guitar player, there's things that I don't even realize are important. Yeah. Like tubes are cool, but these capacitors, these are boring, but they're so integral to what goes on behind the scenes.
What is a piece of technology, particularly on the treatment side and less on the imaging side, that you wish you had that either doesn't exist or you don't have access to?
I wish I had time to study. That's a great question. I mean, I'm so focused on FNIRS.
Yeah.
I want that to be heightened. Have you got any exposure to the Aftershocks?
I don't think so.
Okay.
What's Aftershocks?
Aftershocks are another piece of technology that we use here that I thought of. Aftershocks are, I think they're headphones, but
I've seen them, and I've briefly, a patient was like, here, I was like, what are they?
Right.
And he handed me his, and I briefly felt them.
Would you think about them?
It seems wild. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah.
Because I got a brief explanation from him.
Essentially what they are is they're headphones. Instead of putting them in your ears and doing the traditional pathway where sound bounces off the eardrum, down the small bones, the ossicles, to the cochlea, essentially your body doing a fast Fourier transform, right? Taking these frequencies and turning them into neuronal impulses, right? That's the traditional path. But, what if you have issues with that conduction down the ossicles? Or what if you want to get into other systems than just the auditory pathway? Then sounds are conducted through the bone to the cochlea still. That also stimulates the vestibular system.
Patients that are super dizzy or having balance issues. I spoke to someone who, he said, one side of my vestibular system's working, the other not so much, and so we're trying to rebalance it by stimulating one side and not the other. And he said actually he had a concussion and then he keeps hitting his head because his balance isn't very good, and so he keeps getting reconcussed over and over again, which just sounds awful.
I think a big part of, we've talked about it, we'd like to move into the future of what's post-care look like.
Yeah.
And so, apps are ways to help with patient compliance.
Yeah.
Because the biggest improvements we're going to see are in this first week. But when we send you home, we're going to give you a bunch of exercises, right?
Yeah.
And that's great. And we have a lot of patients that are like, I will do these.
Yeah.
And they might even, it's going to be every day, here's the schedule.
Yeah.
But finding a way to connect with patients, to have applications or various the technologies that they can do this stuff at home.
Yeah, I'm smiling because that's literally what's been going through my head in the past day or two is how do I build some of this stuff at home so I can keep doing this stuff? Right? How do I recreate kind of this jungle gym gymnasium you have here, gym for the brain? How do I recreate that at home so I can keep doing this stuff, right? And at a fundamental level, at a technology level, I think a lot of people watching this are going to see, I could build that with an Arduino and a light and some buttons. Fundamentally, a lot of this stuff isn't very difficult. There's a lot that goes into it in terms of making it clinically relevant, right? But at a basic hardware level, there's not a lot to it. There are some things that are more complicated, eye tracking and things like that.
Right.
But a lot of it's just pushing buttons and lights, or it's touchscreens.
And even making those technologies updated and working smoothly, things like that. Very a lot of those technologies, there's always room for, can we make it even better?
Yeah.
That's what Gen 2 or the FNCI 2.0 is. How do we improve this technology?
Yeah.
And so even for eye tracking, how do we make it even more accurate and proficient?
Yeah.
So when you ask me, what other technologies do you need? What are the answers I'm giving you?
Yeah.
How do I do patient care better? How do I get to see the patient more, interact with them moving forward?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you alluded to earlier, I know an ongoing challenge for me is going to be habit formation and maintaining my habits around doing all these things.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at my worst with my concussion, it was basic things like brush your teeth, comb your hair, which is, things I could think about, but decreasing my cognitive load around it.
Yeah.
And so that I wasn't constantly having to think about what are the next six things I need to do, and just know that once I start this routine, it's going to take me through it, and I can kind of daydream and I can focus on what I'm doing and whatever. Just was a game changer.
And that's huge moving forward with our patients. And I think a huge component of that, my thoughts for seeing our patients here, is feedback. Because habits can be great, but if you're investing in something and forming something, but you're not seeing the returns, and we're sometimes really bad at seeing returns, especially if they're increasing slowly over time. How do you boil a frog? You increase the water slowly, right?
Yeah.
You don't notice it.
And particularly if it's variable and slowly increasing over time. So you're still having bad days, and you're well, I'm not making any progress. Right. But your better days are a little bit better, and your bad days are a little bit less bad, and that's very hard to see.
Well, and that's another big part of what we focus on here is by doing this week of intensive therapies, you are getting feedback.
Yes.
You are seeing that improvement over time, and you have those healthcare workers that are able to have time to give you feedback moving forward.
And for me, one of the big things was objective metrics, right? One of the questions I've hated the most in all of my treatment is rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. It's such a subjective metric. And so to be able to have things like your right eye system that can measure eye tracking, right? That's not just a therapist looking at what my eyes are doing, but is actually an eye tracking system that gives me a report that shows where my eyes were on target so that I can see it and say, okay, yes, I see what you're talking about now that my left eye is not tracking properly, right? Things like being able to see specific tasks, see the time it takes me to do them decrease over the week, right? And then obviously the granddaddy is going to be to see my Fmri change later today, and I'm really excited to see how that blood flow is going to change.
We've seen so many patients that have come to us and said, I was going to try other places, but they don't show the outcomes.
Right.
Whereas we're showing, here's what our patients' lives look like afterwards. Here's the statistics.
And I think, unfortunately, to your detriment, your results are so good that they look fake. And I was a little hesitant to come because I was like, I think maybe this is snake oil. And now that I'm here, it's very obvious that you know exactly what you're doing.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, it was great talking with you.
Taking the time. Yeah, and it's really fun to dive into all the technology behind this and all the methodology with someone who's equally geeky and excited about it. So,
well,
thank you.